Welcome everyone. What an amazing turnout today after St. Patrick's. I want to congratulate us all for being up and ready to learn a little bit more about accessibility this morning. So yeah, just to give the context, Jack, to everyone attending today. This webinar being run by yourselves in AbilityNet is done through a partnership with the National Disability Authority and the Irish Computer Society. We are in the National Disability Authority, the national monitoring body for purposes of the EU Web Accessibility Directive. So I expect, and I see a lot of very familiar names and faces on this call this morning. So I expect a lot of organisations represented here today are from the public sector, and that the aim, I think, for a lot of people today is to learn a little bit more about embedding accessibility into projects. So we've run a number of training webinars before, and they're available on our website, universaldesign.ie. But as along with myself, I'm eager to learn a little bit more about embedding accessibility into projects. We have some more trainings coming up with yourselves, Jack, on Tuesday, the 9th of April. We'll have accessibility for developers on ARIA and the accessibility tree. That's going to be much more technical and for maybe a slightly different audience, although some people here will be involved in both project management and the technical side of accessibility on their website. Just to remind every public body that is subject to monitoring here today, and I know not everyone falls under that category. Some of you are Irish Computer Society members. Some of you are from the private sector. But if you are a public body subject to monitoring by NDA this year, we have a free DQ University license for you. And you're already registered or should be already registered on our monitoring and reporting platform, and you can request it through that. And just to say, any questions or queries about the monitoring we're doing or any assistance you need with accessibility, if you're a public body, please do contact us at webaccessmonitor@nda.ie. So that's it. Over to you, Jack. I'm really looking forward to today's webinar. So thank you very much for giving me those couple of minutes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Don. I really appreciate it. So yeah, welcome everyone to today. We're looking at embedding accessibility at every stage of your project. So yeah, my name is Jack Baker. I'm an accessibility consultant with AbilityNet. We are also joined by my colleague Paul, who will just be helping out in the background and be answering some questions in the chat, providing some resources. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Paul. And our work is always quite varied, but involves things like testing websites, apps, documents, any sort of digital content really for accessibility, and also providing support to help organizations design and develop more accessible content. We're also involved in things like diverse user accessibility testing and user research. And we also deliver a lot of training and webinars around different areas of accessibility, which I thoroughly enjoy. So yeah, thank you so much for having me here today and for giving me your time. And then just very briefly for those who maybe aren't aware of who we are. So AbilityNet is essentially a technology charity providing a range of free and paid for products, services and resources, with our vision being a digital world that is accessible to all. And as an organization, we also run some cool annual events, such as the Tech for Good, which highlights innovation by individuals and organizations in the social interest, and TechShare Pro, which is the largest event or one of the largest events in Europe, where accessibility experts meet up, talk about new concepts, best practices, share ideas, things like that. So yeah, keep an eye out for those. And then just some general housekeeping bits before we get into the content. So you should be able to toggle the captions on and off, but do let me know if you're having any issues with that. Please also do ask questions at any time, whether that's by unmuting yourself or if you wish to add your question to the chat. Whatever suits you is absolutely fine. I will also be stopping periodically throughout just to see if any questions have come in or to give you time to ask them. And the chat can also be used for general conversation or resource sharing, so do feel free to use that. And these slides, along with my speaker notes, any links I have in there, etc., and a transcript and the recording will be made available to you in the coming days. So yeah, if you miss anything or you want to go back over something, then you'll absolutely be able to do that. So just a brief outline. As I said, today is about embedding accessibility at every stage of your project. So this course is perhaps primarily aimed at those wishing to create a robust accessibility policy. So people that are perhaps product owners or managers in development environments, managers at an organizational level. But as an accessibility policy affects all roles throughout the development process, this content will also be relevant to roles such as developers or testers or designers, content authors. So yeah, a whole wide range of roles. It is a high-level overview from a more strategic point of view. So while we'll be covering a lot, the more technical side of things, I guess, will come from the developers webinar that Conal mentioned. But hopefully you will find a lot of useful information around how you can go about creating your own accessibility policies and then start embedding accessibility at every stage of the project's lifecycle. The session will be about around an hour and a half, and in this time we'll be looking to cover why we make the web accessible. So, why do it in the first place? Why an accessibility policy is actually needed. We'll also talk about creating those policies. We'll talk a bit about planning and ownership. We'll look at some different policy principles, some related policies to do with technology in general. And then we'll look at policy feedback and reviewing the policies as well. So first of all, why do we want to make the web accessible? It's always good to answer the why of things before we move on to the how. So it's important to get a better understanding of our reasons and motivations that will then lead to these policy creations and hopefully embedding that accessibility across the organization within your projects. So we just have a quote from the inventor of the World Wide Web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and he said the power of the web is in its universality. So access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. So the web was built to be far-reaching and inclusive. So when we talk about accessibility, we're really talking about people and barriers to being part of this digital world. So it's good to first frame these things in terms of an ethical sense. So the world is online now more than ever, and we can do a lot of things from the comfort of our own homes. And this can be extremely beneficial for users with disabilities in particular, who may, for example, struggle to get to a bank or get to a shop. But in order for the web to be a good resource for them, it must be accessible. And there's a great quote that says, "It's not the person, but their environment that disables them." So having an accessible digital product promotes equal opportunities and access to information and services. But supporting assistive technology does more than just equalize users. It empowers them, it gives them freedom, independence and control in their own lives, which of course is every human right. So for example, JAWS, it's a type of assistive technology that sought to help with this. So JAWS is a popular screen reader, and it stands for Job Access with Speech. So it was originally designed to give people equal access to work and help them perform their job roles, but it's now evolved beyond just that and currently helps millions of people access digital content, but only if their content is made accessible. But accessibility is also good for business, and we're not just necessarily talking about profits here, but also in terms of reputation and user engagement and experience. So of course, if you're in the public sector, perhaps this not all of these points will stand true for you. But yeah, on average, around 15% of the world's population are disabled, which is approximately 1 billion people. And then there's this idea of the purple pound. So this is essentially the potential spending power of disabled people and their families. So within the UK, I know you're in Ireland at the moment, but you'll probably see roughly similar numbers. This is currently up to at least 274 billion pounds of yearly spending. So there's a large commercial market, of course. But as I said, it's not just about the monetary side. You also encourage loyalty by producing accessible content. And if people can access your content, then they're more likely to recommend your products or services to those who have access needs. But it also enhances your brand. So, showing an accessibility commitment can increase loyalty as well as your brand's reputation or your service's reputation. It can also help drive innovation. So there's many things that were originally designed to help those with disabilities, but are now widely used at a commercial level by everyone. And a good example of this is voice recognition. Initially built for those with motor or cognitive impairments or sight impairments, but is now on nearly all smartphones and home virtual assistants. And accessible products are also easier to maintain. So accessibly built content actually simplifies the code and gives much better structure and consistency to your component libraries, which will then just make it much easier to maintain in the long run. It's also good for SEO. So this is search engine optimization. So obviously when people search for content, if your content is accessible, then it's much more likely to pop up in those search engines. So for example, providing good headings on a web page or good transcripts for a video, for example, can be crawled by these search engines and actually makes your content more searchable. And then finally, it's just good for keeping costs down. So building in accessibility from the start to embed at every stage of the product lifecycle is much more cost effective than trying to retrofit accessibility at the end. But of course, we understand that there's probably projects that are ongoing, that have been completed, that need to be, you need to go back over and check. But going forward, embedding it from the start will just save a lot of money and resources in the long run. And then there's also legal reasons. So we do get into this a bit more later on in the session, but just to kind of briefly make you aware of some of the laws and regulations surrounding accessibility that you may need to consider. So we have the Equal Status Act of 2000, which talks about discrimination and the duty to make reasonable adjustments for those with disabilities. And this was then complemented by the Disability Act of 2005. And this is primarily targeted towards government and public sector, or those receiving public funds. And then there's the new European Accessibility Act coming into effect in June 2025. I say new, it did sort of peak in or came out in 2019. But yeah, coming into effect in June 2025. But essentially, when it comes to digital accessibility in particular, a lot of these come down to conforming to what is called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The current version is 2.2, and level AA is the particular standard that we're looking to achieve. But don't worry, we'll go into this a bit more later on. But essentially, it's an internationally recognized set of guidelines used to create and assess accessible digital content. So if you're meeting the WCAG as we call it, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, then you're well on your way to being covered for web accessibility. But again, we'll dive a bit deeper into these when we look at the regulations and standards surrounding policy principles. So when thinking about disability, we can largely divide it into four main areas of vision, hearing and communication, mobility and touch, and cognitive and learning. But it is important to state that these are groups of impairments, not groups of people. So we need to be a little bit mindful here, as people can have a broad range of disabilities that could overlap more than one of these groups here. But these definitions tend to be the first thing that comes to mind when we think of accessibility. And it is, sort of the driving force behind why we do what we do and why you're here today, because there's groups of people with certain dependencies, and we want to know, to what extent they're being catered for or not being catered for. But humans are messy. We don't always fit into these neat little boxes. Everyone has different abilities and different experiences of their disability, and therefore different experiences of the world around them. So, there's even spectrums within each of these categories. So, for example, vision could be someone who has a mild visual impairment to someone who is completely blind. And it's similar with mobility and hearing and cognition as well. Especially cognition. It's a particularly very large area, a wide spectrum of impairments, and a lot to consider. So, you could have someone who is dyslexic, or you could have someone who is autistic. But within these subcategories, there's an extremely diverse spectrum. So it can be a little bit reductive as we're using these, very broad categories, but it can give us a bit of a framework to talk about some of this stuff. But the main message here really is that when we think of accessibility, it's the degree to which access is available to as many people as possible. We can't have a one-size-fits-all approach, and we cannot assume that everyone will perceive our content in the same way. It's really about recognizing that there is diversity and then trying to design for that. Because if we're not taking into consideration the range of diverse access needs that people have, then we can unintentionally exclude people from accessing our digital content. But that leads to the thinking that it's not just about disability and having that tunnel vision approach to each of these categories. It's really about design that benefits everyone. And that leads us to what is called inclusive design, which is about designing robust products or services that are usable for as many people as possible, where the user should be able to adapt the digital product to meet their own requirements as well. And this example on my slides is from the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit. And it essentially conveys that our abilities can be affected by short-term injuries or conditions. Our abilities can also change in different environments and contexts. And therefore, access needs can be permanent, temporary, or situational. So for example, in terms of having a mobility or touch impairment, someone could have a permanently missing limb, someone could have temporarily broken their arm, or they could be in a situation where they're carrying a baby or they're carrying some shopping. But in each of these instances, you have someone who is unable to use both hands to use their technology. And similarly, in terms of being visually impaired, you could have someone who is permanently blind. You could have someone who has temporarily had cataract surgery or an eye infection, or they could be in a situation where they're a distracted driver, or even just they have some some glare from the sun impairing their vision. And again, in each of these instances, that vision is impaired. And so essentially we're saying that, in accessibility, we too often do tend to focus on permanent disabilities when actually we all have access needs relating to vision or hearing or mobility and cognition, whether they're permanent, temporary, or situational, and that addressing these potential access barriers through inclusive design will actually benefit everyone. There are also wider ranging universal benefits of building accessible content by default and from the ground up. And this leads to well-formed semantics and native elements, which you'll, if you're attending the developers webinar, you'll have a bit more of a look into that. But essentially, it's about using consistent, standardized, and robust code that comes with accessibility built in. And it also leads to projects that avoid reinventing the wheel. So you're not always building content from scratch. You'll have consistent components and rules that you can use and follow repeatedly across the organization, which are just more innately accessible and easier to adjust and fix when needed. And this will lead to more robust pattern libraries and design systems. So you have a nice, healthy library of elements and components that can be consistently utilized across your projects and teams, which means you'll have default accessibility and standardized compliance across the board, first time, every time. And it also leads to content that degrades gracefully. So you want content that still works on different devices, different device sizes, or when, for example, CSS has been disabled, or if JavaScript fails, due to security reasons or having low bandwidth, you want that robust layer of support to fall back on. That's not to say that you shouldn't use CSS and JavaScript to aid or to support user experience, but it's about not relying on them for the user's core experience. And when you create accessible content, you'll be doing just that. So why is an accessibility policy needed? So we want accessibility to be considered through all stages of the project lifecycle to ensure that digital content is and remains accessible. So an accessibility policy really helps to ensure that we have a clear vision for this and provides a robust framework to embed default accessibility within and across the organization. So some of the life cycle stages where we especially want accessibility considered include before the actual design and build work begins. So this is about being clear about your objectives and identifying the technologies that you'll be using, but also being aware of and planning for any potential issues you may come across, as well as understanding diverse user needs and technical requirements as well. And of course, during the design and build phases, so where you can check any wireframes, any mock-ups or templates for any actual or potential accessibility concerns, and then testing components and pages through each iteration to ensure you remain compliant. And also during doing some user research throughout as well to make sure that you have input from disabled users, because you just can't beat having that lived experience and those people communicating their thoughts to the accessibility and the usability of your content. And then when you go to launch the product and prepare to go live, you can ensure that all accessibility requirements have been met on the build to be released and that your digital content is compliant. And then, of course, as the site is live, you also want to make sure that you're maintaining an accessible website and regularly monitoring it for accessibility. As well, ensuring the accessibility of any content that's been placed on your site since its creation is also accessible, and making sure that you have or allow for feedback from users, and then adapting your site as necessary. So there are a few things that we can be aware of, just at a high level in terms of accessibility at the different stages of the product's lifecycle. This is a non-exhaustive list, but just a couple of initial things that we can think about. So when we're at the initial design stage, we can think about things like our use of colors and icons. So are we using colors that contrast well with adjacent colors? And this includes text, but also informative images and icons. And are the icons we're using consistent and understandable for everyone? When it comes to the focus indicator and page layout, we want to make sure that the keyboard focus indicator is clearly visible. So this is what you see when you, for example, tab around a page. So use your keyboard to tab. You'll hopefully see a nice, visible, clear focus indicator or focus outline. And you want to make sure that there is a logical keyboard focus path defined through the elements that will be interactive. So as you're moving through the page, as you're tabbing through the page, is it moving in a logical order? And does the page itself have a simple and clear layout, including how the layouts may change depending on the screen size or if content is magnified, for example? And you may also be using templates, in which case it's a really great time to make sure that the templates are accessible and adhere to some of these things that we've just discussed, but also perhaps looking at desktop versus mobile templates as well. And when we're at the development stage, we can think more about things like forms accessibility. So forms are quite an important part of any website and usually necessary for users to progress through a journey. So it is really vital that any input fields or buttons or radio buttons, checkboxes, drop-down boxes, etc., are accessible. Of course, I mentioned a bit about keyboard access, but at this stage, we want to make sure that everything on your website can be accessed and operated with the keyboard only, just because some users may not be able to use a mouse. And this is one of the best checks that you can do, as so many assistive technologies also rely on keyboard accessibility, such as screen readers, but also braille devices. There's things called switch devices, even speech recognition and eye tracking software can rely very heavily on that simple keyboard interaction. You also want to consider responsive design. So this is how a page and its contents shift to adjust to different screen sizes. So when viewing on a desktop or a mobile, for example, or when zooming in and magnifying the page. And you want to think about how this will look and some of the behavior can also be looked into at the design stage, as I mentioned, but we also want to make sure that in the build, our components and our content are still available and operable and perceivable by everyone. And in terms of the content that we can then put on our site, we want to be aware of things like images, so determining if they are informative or if they're just decorative, and then applying the appropriate alternative text for them. Also multimedia, so this could be videos or audio or both, and ensuring that we have appropriate alternatives for these as well where relevant. So for example, we want to include transcripts and captions for audio. This could be to do with including audio description for videos, etc. In terms of language, are you using clear and concise language? Are you avoiding or at least explaining any sort of jargon or technical terms that you're using, or any sort of acronyms or idioms, for example, and just being mindful of those things. So we can see that accessibility can be embedded at all of these stages of the product's lifecycle, and then it's not just the responsibility of the developers, as is often assumed. It really is a cross-team responsibility. But accessibility is a journey, it's not a destination. It's not just a one-time project, it's something that we need to continually consider. It's about embedding and integrating accessibility as early as possible and as widely across the organization as possible. And this requires policies, processes, and quality assurance so that it doesn't just fall off the agenda. It has design, content, procurement, and technical implications, as we'll talk about. And it also involves staff across the organization, as we've said, and everyone needs to be on board and understand the vision and the reasoning of why you are continuing down that path. So that was a bit of an intro there, but does anyone have any questions at the moment? As I said, we will be stopping periodically throughout, so if there's no questions at the moment, there will definitely be opportunities as we go along. I'll just have a quick look. Oh, yeah. Yeah, just saying about sending the slides after. Yes, absolutely. You'll be getting the, for those who have joined, you'll be getting the slides, the slide deck, all of my speaker notes, links, and everything that's in there, as well as the recording of this session and a transcript as well to go with that. So yeah, if you've missed anything or you need to pop out, whatever the case may be, you will get the recording so you can catch up on that. Oh, we've got a question there. Is there a checker for keyboard access? So there are tools, and we'll have a look at some of these tools later on, but there are tools to kind of help with keyboard access. There are different ways, obviously, that we want to check out our keyboard access. There's a few aspects we want to consider. So as I mentioned, we want to make sure that we've got that visible focus indicator. That has to be a manual check, but that can be a relatively quick manual check. Just go onto your web page, use the tab key, and see if you can see where the keyboard indicator is and how visible that is as well. We want to make sure that's nice and clear. There's also things like making sure that you can actually tab onto all of the interactive elements. So when we use our tab key, we don't want to tab onto paragraphs of text, for example, static things like that. We just want to tab onto the interactive elements. And so there are tools that can help us to determine if something is interactive in that case. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we're going through our page in a logical way. We don't want the focus to be jumping from one element to another in no sort of logical order. We want to make sure it's nice. Almost in sort of reading order pattern is usually the way that we go, left to right, top to bottom, and just making sure that is quite a logical order. So the best way to do it is just to kind of use your keyboard. I don't believe there's a manual checker that will ensure that for you, just because they don't always know. And we'll go on to sort of automated testing versus manual testing, but they don't always know what order something should be in. So it is always best to do it manually and just use your tab key, tab through the page, and that should give you a good idea of the accessibility in terms of keyboard access. But yeah, we'll be having a look at some of the tools later on, and perhaps that will help you out. But yeah, great question. Thank you very much. We've got a question about modal. So should we use ARIA modal true, or shall we use ARIA hidden true for other non-modal siblings? So we usually say to go for ARIA modal true when we're talking about modals. Of course, when you, I don't know if you are attending the developers webinar, that's upcoming, but you'll be going into more detail about ARIA and code for accessibility. And it may be a case-on-case basis, depends on the context, but typically we would say ARIA modal true should be placed on modals. We've got another comment in the chat. Hey there, I'm disabled. Just want to say thanks for making my life easier for me, because good. Some people are difficult. Permanent TSBs, online banking is atrocious. Yeah, so it's never a given to have accessible websites. Thanks for shifting things. Oh, amazing. Well, thank you for your comment. Yeah, I guess that's why we're all here. We all want to make content more accessible for everyone. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate it. And yeah, it's still not in the place that we want it to be, which is why we still have to push these things. And yeah, but yeah, I really appreciate you sharing your experience there. How can you check if your website is accessibility compliant? Yes, good question. Difficult to answer, but essentially it's through accessibility testing. So it depends if you have the in-house resources to do that. Generally, it's, and we'll look at this in the upcoming sections where we talk about standards and regulations. But usually if you're conformant to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, So as I briefly mentioned, just a set of criteria that you have to meet in order to be conformant. A lot of laws and regulations point to these guidelines as the standard for, if you meet this, then you'll generally be compliant for accessibility. But again, that can be quite a technical endeavor, can be quite resource heavy. A lot of people do sort of outsource for that where necessary. So you can go to certain organizations, AbilityNet, for example, not to plug ourselves, but that's one of the things that we do. We do carry out those compliance audits. But of course, there's plenty of other organizations that will do that and make sure that you are conforming to any of those sort of regulations. But yeah, we'll have a look a bit more later on that. But yeah, very good question. Fantastic. So let's move on to looking at creating a policy. So to create an accessibility policy, we need to have a more strategic approach. But this doesn't mean we need a lengthy document that goes into great technical detail. Ideally, we want to make sure that anyone can pick it up and understand the purpose and its contents. So we want to ensure it's clear to everyone, regardless of their background or their tech knowledge, and also include the key overarching principles and what we want to achieve from the policy. So we want to explain the organization's commitment to web accessibility so that everyone knows of its importance and that you're all on the same page with regard to the organization's vision. And it can also reference other policies that are in place as well, such as if you have an equality policy, for example, or other digital strategies about inclusion. And these can even be amended or adapted to help to incorporate or to at least work alongside your accessibility policy. And when creating the policy, we also want to think about the scope of what actually needs to be included in the policy. So it's important to be clear about what digital products, services, or publications will be covered by the policy and to list them out. So whether that's an external website, it could be a mobile application, it could be documents that you use as well, or any video content. It could also be emails as well. And is this new content? Is it something that already exists? Or is it content that's potentially being updated? You also want to consider whether the policy applies to your intranet as well, or other sort of internal digital applications or platforms, or some of the tools that you use, the documents that you use, or emails that go around internally and that are used by your staff. Because we often do tend to think that accessibility is about external websites and external apps for our clients or for our end users. But we also want to think about the internal systems that our staff use as well, because as well as your customers or end users, you also want to make sure that any staff with disabilities have equal access as well. You also want to make sure you have a timeline for implementing the policy and that that's clearly communicated as well. So for example, there may be certain legislation that requires you to meet specific standards and be compliant by a certain date. You may want to include that. You may also choose to roll out your platforms at different times, also different parts of the organization at different times, so that may need to be noted there. So yeah, just some good steps to take would be to review your digital products and services to capture a definitive list of the types that you have, and then decide which platforms are in scope immediately and which are perhaps excluded until a certain date. Or even perhaps indefinitely, if there's something that perhaps is, an older system that will be potentially archived, for example. So just talk a bit about planning and ownership. So it's really important to make sure that you plan ahead so that you can have resources and budget in place to tackle and fix any barriers that may arise ahead of launching a product, such as whether staff have the right tools that they need, do they have the right training as well, and do existing policies support the new policy and new ways of working. And you also want to think about how accessible the product currently is. So here you can look into what awareness or knowledge and skills that you already have within your organization. I mean, you'll be surprised at how many people already have a passion towards making content accessible and then have perhaps even taken things into their own hands to implement this. But it's not, part of the organization-wide processes yet. It's just kind of individuals with that passion and that drive. So definitely checking around and seeing if there's any sort of hub of knowledge already existing within your organizations. There are chunks chunks. There are checks that you can do to gauge the current maturity of your accessibility program, and then see what the next steps are to slowly progress towards the next level of becoming more accessibly inclusive. And this is through what is referred to as a maturity model. But accessibility is really a journey with no destination, and there's always something to work on and build towards. And I've put some links to a few maturity model resources that are definitely worth looking at. And at their core, they are all very similar to some degree, perhaps some slight word changing. But I've included a link to one that we provide here at AbilityNet that you can download for free. And I'll just briefly touch on how that works, just to give you a glimpse into how useful maturity models can be. So here at AbilityNet, as I said, we have a free maturity model tool that helps organizations deliver digital services and products that are accessible and inclusive. And it does this by mapping your current level of accessibility maturity by proposing certain success criteria that will show your sort of strengths and your limitations. And it then defines actions and prioritizes the next steps for a logical path to incrementally progress them towards the next level of maturity and to meeting further criteria. And this is also a really useful way of providing a measurable sort of benchmark for future review. So essentially, it sees where you currently are in terms of your accessibility maturity, and then progresses you or shows you some actions that you can take to progress you up through that maturity. And it can be used as a self-assessment tool, or it can be facilitated by consultants. So essentially, you measure the overall accessibility maturity of your organization by looking into 5 key dimensions and then scoring yourself on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is kind of very informal in that journey and 5 is optimal. So you're at the sort of the height of that particular item. And that just determines the current levels that you're at within each of them. And these levels or these dimensions are to do with the vision. So looking at, does your organization have a clearly stated vision about why and how it's adopting best practice in accessibility and inclusive design? It looks at leadership. So is the organization committed to investing in the people and the resources that it needs to deliver its vision? It looks at processes. So is accessibility and inclusive design embedded in every stage of the project development lifecycle, which is what we're looking at today. It looks at capability. So does the organization have the skills, the tools, and the resources it needs to deliver its vision? And it also looks at procurement, which we'll talk a little bit about today as well. So does the organization ensure that purchasing decisions are compliant and contribute to its vision? Procurement is one that we often see that is sort of left out a little bit, because people often look at their own sort of capabilities and the things that they're building and they're designing, not realizing that if you actually procure certain content or certain digital products, that they could be breaking your compliance. So do ensure that they are also accessible and they do meet the requirements as well. And each of these dimensions has lots of different criteria that will help you to score yourself between 1 and 5. So yeah, definitely something worth looking at to help you sort of measure your own internal accessibility maturity within each of these dimensions, and then to help you sort of progress through that. And then once you know your current levels, we then want to think about creating milestones. And this is so that we can achieve that incremental progress and conformance. And the size of the milestones can depend on where you are in your journey or in your maturity. So if you're starting out from scratch, it can be quite overwhelming and daunting. So make sure that you're not trying to fix and solve everything at once. Remember, accessibility is a journey, and as you get the ball rolling with these incremental milestones, it will soon pick up pace. So for example, you could try and make sure you have a communal accessibility hub within your organization where everyone within can discuss ideas and share resources on accessibility. Or you could make sure that your website or app has an accessibility statement. So it doesn't always have to be these massive sort of leaps and bounds. Sometimes it can just be starting off quite small, implementing accessibility where you can, and then hopefully getting the ball rolling and having that sort of effect compound throughout the organization. But you could also have an existing product, maybe even somewhere in the middle of your accessibility journey. But it is still important to take stock of where your limitations lie and put these milestones in to further your accessibility implementations. So for example, this could be to ensure that all staff have the necessary accessibility skills and awareness training, or that you have an executive level accessibility sponsor that champions the implementation of accessibility across the organization.
What?
It's important to note that this applies to all digital experiences, so not just websites. So, be thinking about other products that you may have, whether they're external or internal facing, and how these can be incorporated into that as well. So ownership is another large part of this, and it's often where difficulties lie in getting things off the ground. So as we mentioned before, it's often thought that accessibility is the responsibility of developers, when in actuality it should be an organization-wide concern, and an accessibility policy can really help to embed this. But ultimately, to be truly successful, you should always aim to have some sort of senior management involved as the sort of the document owner for these policies. And this really helps for it to be taken seriously, as well as to help with budget and resource provisions as well where needed. But you also want to have a day-to-day contact who can be easily contacted with regards to any queries surrounding the policy. They can be known as the accessibility lead, and they don't even necessarily need to have a high technical knowledge. It's just someone who is passionate about accessibility and can be a general point of contact for staff or even external suppliers, and then just signpost people to the correct places. And this also doesn't need to be their main responsibility, at least not at first, but can just be a part of their role. And the BBC have what is referred to as an Accessibility Champions Network, which is a group of people who have embedded accessibility within their organisations, and they share knowledge and resources and give advice to help promote accessibility as well. So this is a really useful place to sort of seek help and ask questions, just to ensure that accessibility is embedded at every stage and not just as an afterthought. So yeah, do check out that link. It's a really good group of people who do share a lot of information around accessibility and the best ways to embed that within your organization. I'm just going to stop here again to see if any more questions have come in or any comments or queries. So just looking at the chat. Okay, cool. Looks like all you've shared a good few resources there. Oh, and you've answered the question about where the accessibility policy should be placed. Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think we just got another one come in though. So I'm a creative digital media student at TU Dublin at Blanchardstown. Actually did some volunteer work with the NDA at the RDS a few months ago. Fantastic. Working on an assignment for Universal Design. I'm just wondering, for screen readers, what's the best to implement it? I'm writing a report on Blanchardstown's shopping centre and Blanch people from all walks of life. How do I get the tech to say people's names correctly? Just because I know for myself with an Irish name, I've heard computers say the wrong thing constantly. So I want to try avoid that for everybody. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a really tricky sort of contentious part of in the accessibility field of so for anyone who maybe isn't aware, a screen reader is essentially a bit of assistive technology that will not only read out sort of text on the page, but it reads out, for example, if something is a button or if something's a heading. So it gives a bit more depth of information, but essentially something that communicates what is on the screen and sort of announces that in sort of a speaking format. And is often used by people with sort of visual impairments to help them communicate that information, but can also be used by those with say learning difficulties or reading difficulties as well. And one of the difficulties is making sure that certain words are announced correctly by that screen reader. Just because there's some words are spelt the same way but have different pronunciation, or as you said with Irish names in particular, maybe quite a tricky situation for screen readers. So people have asked us before, should I try and within the code try and change how something is spelt, try and spell it out phonetically perhaps, but then you can get into sort of other accessibility problems there. So for example, someone's using speech recognition. If they try to say, press this button, but you've now relabeled it to something slightly different, then it may not work. So yeah, trying to fix something for one may end up breaking it for someone else. So it is a really tricky point. And so it's not something that we would recommend you do. I do completely understand what you're saying, that you don't want these screen readers to be announcing contact and names incorrectly. So yeah, it is just one of those things. People that are using screen readers do get used to how things are pronounced and kind of understand that if this is announced one way, then actually this is what they mean. So yeah, it is a tricky thing. I will look at some more research on that for you, and I'll put that in the slides so that when you get them, there's a bit more info there. And I'll take a bit of a deeper dive into, specifically for names and things like that. But yeah, it is a really awkward one at the moment, just because the screen reader technology perhaps still isn't as good as we want it to be. It's still an incredible tool that helps lots of people, but perhaps isn't quite there in terms of recognizing certain names. But there are ways that we can implement, sort of Irish language settings in there or Gaelic settings in there. So perhaps that might help with the specific pronunciation. But yeah, I will have a look into that a bit more for you, and present that in the slides in case that helps. But yeah, great question though. Really great question. So is an accessibility policy mandatory or nice to have? Oh, that's in response to Paul's content. Perhaps Paul, you can take that one on, and I'll continue on with the slides. But yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for the questions. So just moving on to policy principles now. We'll be primarily talking about a suggested policy outline, but this can be adapted to fit your particular requirements and is by no means set in stone. It just sets out some of the core things to think about, but every organization is different, so how the policy is structured is entirely up to yourselves. But first, it is important to have a look at some of the regulations and the standards surrounding accessibility. And these may vary, again, depending on your organization and the industry that you work in, how you may be funded, etc. And some laws and regulations may not even apply to you at all, but it is always best to do your own research around what you need to meet for your organization. And just to note that I am not a lawyer, so this will be more of a brief overview. But yeah, these are just some of the requirements that may apply to you within Ireland specifically. And we briefly mentioned them before, but just go into a little bit more detail here. So firstly, as we said, there's the Equal Status Act of 2000, a civil rights law. This essentially prohibits discrimination and requires all organizations to make some form of reasonable adjustments for people with disabilities. And when we say reasonable adjustments, this essentially means putting things in place so that no group of people are disadvantaged by not being able to access or perceive content. And this can be in the form of providing alternative formats. So, for example, allowing users to request large print versions of documents, for example. It can also be, fixing any known accessibility issues on your site if you have a public-facing website. And just to say that having an inaccessible website does count as indirect discrimination because you are limiting access for some users. And this was then complemented by the Disability Act 2005. And this is primarily targeted towards the government and public sector organizations, or perhaps those receiving public funds. So again, may not apply to everyone, but definitely worth looking into to see if you do fit into that category, just because there are some other requirements for that as well. And then there's the European Accessibility Act of 2019. As I said, coming into effect in 2025. Now, this covers all sort of aspects of accessibility from physical to digital, but of course, we'll be focusing on the digital aspect here. And as I've said, when it comes down to digital accessibility in particular, we can just look at conforming to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or the WCAG, as we said. Obviously, with public sector, there are a few more items that you may need to be aware of. So yeah, do check that out. I've put just a note at the bottom here. So obviously, as we've seen today, look at the National Disability Authority, NDA. They do support organizations to meet accessibility standards. So yeah, do check them out and check out their resources. Very, very helpful indeed. But yeah, as you said, most laws and regulations, they do point to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Most do point currently to the 2.1 version, just because 2.2 was only released a few months back. Although I say a few, it was about 5 months ago now. But they will soon point to the 2.2 version, which is the latest version. So do definitely check that out and perhaps look towards or at least working towards that level of conformance. To be honest, there's only a few kind of extra criteria in the new version anyway, so yeah, definitely worth kind of being ahead of that and getting that implemented. And within the WCAG, we want to look at the AA standard of the WCAG, and we'll look at what this means in the coming slides anyway. So we also have this timeline here of some international laws in both the private and public sectors. I won't go into this, but it is just worth noting in case any of these do apply to you for any reason. But most countries do have some form of accessibility standards. These are usually based on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which we'll be moving on to in just a moment. But overall, 84% of countries have laws protecting the rights of persons with disabilities, and 49% of countries define accessibility to cover digital platforms. So that is just due to the hard work of disability campaigners internationally, but of course there is still a long way to go. But the reason why many countries have it in their guidelines is that access to information and services is part of the United Nations CRPD, or the Charter for Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and most countries have just adopted this. And I've got a link in my slides here if you want to take a deeper dive into that, but it is very interesting if you want to check that out. And there may be some procurement specific laws as well and standards that may apply to you. And the key one is the EN 301-549, accessibility requirements for ICT products and services. And this was essentially the first European procurement standard, but essentially this is aligned to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So in terms of websites and web pages, it does basically mean the same thing as conforming to the WCAG. As I said, the latest WCAG is now 2.2, but this has only just been released. So the regulations perhaps won't point to this newer version just yet, but they will in the near future. So yeah, do bear that in mind again for this. But within your accessibility policy, you do want to specify and document what accessibility standards you are adhering to and to what level as well, just so that you're being clear and everyone kind of understands what they're aiming for. So let's have a little bit of a deeper dive into the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG as we call them, just because they are such a prevalent sort of standard to look at. It's a recommendation created by the World Wide Web Consortium, also known as the W3C, as the standard for creating and assessing accessible content. They are internationally recognized and they are often considered gold standard for web accessibility. And it applies to all web content and markup. So it sits alongside HTML and CSS specifications, meaning it includes both the code for structure and presentation, as well as the content and the information provided as well. So it also includes, not just the actual building of the website or the app and how it looks, but also the content that you add to it. So text, images, audio, video, things like that. It is called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So the wording and the techniques of the success criteria do focus on web technologies, but they are quite technology neutral. So the principles can be applied universally to apps and documents as well. As I said, the current version is WCAG 2.2, released back in October, I believe. But this does build upon WCAG 2.1. So if you are familiar with the 2.1 version, then that information is still very much relevant. It's made up of a set of principles, guidelines, and a lot of success criteria. And it consists of 3 conformance levels, which we kind of briefly mentioned before. So they have level A, they have level AA, and they have level AAA. And depending on the standard that you're aiming for, but AA and AA includes A criteria and AA criteria, is usually the targeted standard. So if you're aiming for the AAA criteria, which would be amazing, then you would have to pass the A criteria, the AA criteria, and the AAA criteria. So at the moment, the guidelines are split within those 3 levels, those 3 standards. But yeah, it is important to note that while the WCAG are often pointed to by different laws and regulations, they are not in and of themselves a law. So just to note that. And we can look at the WCAG documentation, but it can be quite an overwhelming bit of information, which is oftentimes quite difficult to understand, especially if you are new to this. But I just wanted to add some alternatives to that to make it a little bit easier to digest, such as the Threefa WCAG quick reference, which gives a really good overview of the guidelines and a nice simple layout. And then the WCAG, which presents information in nice, concise, plain English and gives you nice sort of summaries of the different criteria that you need to adhere to. And it just advises the exact requirements without all of the sort of added technical fluff around it that you will see within the standard guidelines. So yeah, definitely check those out. And then the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines have 4 top-level principles, which form the acronym of PAW. And they say that content should be perceivable, so content should be presented in ways that can be perceived by all. If information cannot be perceived, then it cannot be accessed. Operable, so user interface components and navigation must be operable. And this includes people who potentially can't use a mouse, so people who are dependent upon a keyboard, for example, as we mentioned. Understandable, so information and the operation of the user interface needs to be understandable for users. So text content needs to be readable and understandable. Page interactions should behave in predictable ways and consistent ways, and users need support with completing processes and forms, so making that a lot more easier for them to get through. And then it also needs to be robust, so it needs to be reliable, it needs to be compatible with assistive technology like screen readers, as we mentioned, and different technology standards. And then content needs to also work with different operating systems and browsers, different versions of browsers perhaps, and different devices. They should all work across those platforms. So it needs to be nice and robust and maintain its level of accessibility across those different technologies. So just very briefly looking at an example of one of the WCAG success criteria. So the very first success criteria or criterion is called a non-text content, which requires that non-text content has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. So non-text content is essentially talking about images or icons or graphs, etc. Any sort of visual content that is not textual. So anything that communicates information without using text. So the text alternative, which is, as it says, just text, needs to communicate the same information that is being presented visually. And this can be done with actual text on the page, or as we can see on my slide here, by using the HTML alt attribute to provide this information. But this could also be if you're using a CMS, for example, to implement content on a website, then sometimes there's within those programs, they allow you to add alternative text manually, but essentially when it goes onto the website, this is what it will look like. But this is because assistive technology, like screen readers, need to be explicitly told in text what an image is. They don't generally do any sort of image scanning or analysis or recognition, so they need to be told explicitly what content is. Even though AI is getting a little bit better, it's still not quite on par with understanding, why we've added an image to a page and what that image means and what we want to communicate through that image. So in the example on the slide here, this item here, we can ask ourselves whether the text alternative of T in the alt attribute serves an equivalent purpose to that image. So if you're not familiar with HTML, it's essentially the code that helps to build websites. This is an image tag, which contains this image here. And more importantly, we want to look at this alt attribute. So it's just short for alternative text. And at the moment, it's just got this T in there. So when a screen reader user, for example, comes across this image, all that will be announced is T image, which doesn't really reflect what this image is about. The image is actually some kind of a stone statue of Alan Turing. He's using an early computer, and the statue appears to be in a museum dedicated to him. So if the text alternative was instead a sentence conveying similar information to that, then this would serve an equivalent purpose. But the type of image that you're using and the purpose and the context around why you're using that image is very important here. So I have put a link to the WCAG techniques for passing this success criterion on the slide there, and also a link to an alt decision tree, which helps you to identify the image that you have and how best to approach it accessibly with regards to the alt text that you may need to use. So definitely check those out, very useful resources. But yeah, hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of what we mean by a success criteria within the WCAG. There are over 50 of these, but of course, not all of them will apply to everything you do, so don't worry too much. So just looking at some of the strengths of WCAG. So it's obviously a really good baseline to work from for accessibility. It can help design and development teams to make the content accessible. A lot of work from a lot of people around the world has gone into ensuring that it covers a range of disabilities, and it's becoming, it is now an internationally respected standard. So it's an increasingly in an increasingly number of laws around the world, as we saw earlier. And the conformance levels quickly give you an understanding of the importance of the success criteria. Or I shouldn't say importance, it's more the amount of people that will be affected by it. So as we saw, it was divided into the A, AA, and AAA levels, and within those criteria. So you can potentially prioritize the success criteria based on the level that you're looking to conform to. But generally, if you're looking at level A criteria, this is usually criteria that's a little bit more easier to implement and will benefit a lot of people. The AA criteria gets a little bit more tricky to implement, still not difficult, depending on your content and the context. And then the AAA criteria is can be a lot more difficult and a lot more resource heavy to implement and may not affect as many people. But it's obviously still a great way to go if you can. A lot of, as I said, regulations point to meeting the AA standard, so only looking at the A and AA criteria. But that's not to say that you shouldn't check out the AAA criteria as well, because there are definitely some elements to that you may be able to incorporate. It's just that a lot of them can be a little bit subjective. Some of them may not even be able to implement. So just for a brief example, one of the AAA criteria is to do with the readability of your content. So it's about having your text be a certain reading level, and usually that's sort of lower secondary education. But of course, if you think about organizations that are very technical, if they're sort of universities, they have research papers, etc., then trying to make that into something that's readable by an 11-year-old may not be feasible. So essentially why a lot of regulations point to the AA criteria. But we do want to see that as the minimum standard that we incorporate. It's not really it shouldn't be we've reached AAA and therefore we're 100% wholly accessible. It's more, okay, we've reached the AA compliance. Now where can we go from here? Because there are definitely some weaknesses of WCAG as well, definitely some limitations to it. So it defines conformance as perfection. So it has either a pass or fail limitation to it. And this can be particularly alien to web development in particular, as this is always a continuous process. So the website is more of seen as a living thing that is being added to and amended regularly. But the WCAG doesn't really take this into consideration and essentially demands perfection from the outset. But you can think about obviously prioritizing and meeting criteria in the long term. That's absolutely fine. And it also has limited cost benefit consideration as well. So if you already have an existing digital content, it may take a lot of time and resources to now retrofit the content to now meet certain guidelines, which is obviously why we preach embedding accessibility as early as possible so that you can avoid that. And then the A and AA criteria does not cover a lot of cognitive or learning disabilities as much. They find it very difficult to come up with these sort of pass-fail criteria when it comes to neurodiversity, just because it is such a broad spectrum and what works for one person may not work for another. And so at the moment, they do essentially steer away from that. But within the new 2.2 criteria, they have included more of this, but there is definitely still a long way to go with regards to that. So that's why I say that meeting the AA criteria is a good way to go. It will make you technically compliant, but there will still be space for making your content more accessible and pushing past that to make your content more usable as well for everyone. So because of these WCAG limitations and the fact that every organization and their end users is unique, you may want to include some additional standards that sit on top of the WCAG. So you can develop personal in-house standards, which is what the BBC have done, but this can get quite messy. So we always recommend at least using the WCAG as a base and then perhaps building on those. It is a really good idea to create checklists for different roles. So for your designers, your developers, your testers, your content authors, etc., having checklists for them, along with detailed documentation on using the standards as well. And this just keeps everything consistent and efficient within your organization. And if you do have additional standards, then just make sure that you're able to share these with any sort of third-party organizations when it comes to procuring services, and just making sure that there's no sensitive information in them, of course, just so that they are aware of the standards that you're looking to meet, and can obviously then make that a better fit for you in the long term. And you also want to have a consistent approach for dealing with cases where standards are perhaps not met. So understanding that it's not necessarily permanent, and then just making sure that you're documenting the reasons behind why something is not yet met. So, where the concerns lie and what needs to be done. And then just putting together a path and a timeline for when you can remediate any issues and can become conformant. And of course, prioritizing the workload if there's a lot to do and there's many changes to make. But just briefly, there are some key factors that you may want to think about when prioritizing certain exemptions. So it could be the extent or the frequency of the occurrence of an issue. So is it something that is on every web page, for example, or on an important page? Then you may want to bump that up the priority list. The size of the audience that the issue will cause difficulties for may also be something worth considering. So understanding your audience and who uses your service can be quite important here. But of course, we don't want to get down to the nitty gritty of, okay, how many screen reader users do I have? How many motor impaired people do I have? How many visually impaired people do I have? We don't want to get down to that, trying to specifically design for certain groups of people. As we mentioned before, it's about inclusive design, and so designing something that will benefit everyone. We don't really want to get down to that sort of granular detail of who precisely is using our website and try and design for them. It's about designing for everyone, but perhaps knowing your audience will help you to prioritize some items. And then the impact of the issue on a person's use of the product as well. So is it a higher priority where a certain user is completely blocked from accessing certain content, or is it more of a medium priority concern, where they can use the content, but it's just quite laborious or frustrating for them? Or is it a low priority where there's just some minor inconveniences that need ironing out? So to kind of put them into that sort of priority perspective as well. So any more questions at this point? I'll just have a quick check of the chat. Paul, so you're on hand there. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, great resource. Juicy Studios readability test. Thank you very much for sharing. Cool. So no more questions. We can.
There was one thing that I didn't have an answer to, and you may not either, hand, but it would be buried somewhere in the chat now because it's a bit further up. No, that's fine. It was I can't even remember who asked it. That might have been Laura, but it was about whether we got any examples of accessibility policies that we could point to. If anybody publishes theirs online or anything like that we could point to. I don't know of any.
Good question. Yeah, none that I am familiar with. I know most people are quite secretive with theirs. It might be worth looking. I know he shared the link to the Accessibility Champions Network. That might be a good place to look. But yeah, we can absolutely look into that. Yeah, apologies for missing that there. But
no, that's okay. There was a lot there.
Yeah. But yeah, absolutely. That's something we can look into and see if we can find any that any organizations have shared. Hopefully they have. I would say most don't share their own internal ones just because there may be some sensitive information there. But yeah, definitely something we can absolutely look into for you. And I'll add it into a resources section within the slides.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you. Okay, fantastic. So Just moving on to accessibility statements then. So within your accessibility policy, you may want to specify which digital platforms require an accessibility statement, and also who is responsible for creating and updating the statement as well. And this is particularly important for public sector organizations, as I believe this is a requirement for you to have an accessibility statement. And we'll look at that now. So an accessibility statement is a place to share accessibility information with your users, so where they can use it as a reference if they have any problems. It's just a great way to reach out to your audience and get that sort of more personalization. So it helps explain to users your digital accessibility objectives, so where you currently sit, where you need to improve, and your aims for the future. It helps to demonstrate accessibility compliance as well. As I said, especially for public sector, as a statement is a requirement there. And it provides a dedicated source on how to access your platform. So it can give details of what is supported, any known issues that may affect certain user groups. So you may not need to provide one by law, but it makes your users feel much more included and heard, and allows for some transparency as well, which people always appreciate. So we definitely highly recommend it. And people often say, do we really want to be sharing where our limitations are, where we're not accessible? That doesn't really give a good impression. But actually, the opposite is true. You'll actually garner more respect and a better reputation and more loyalty from your users when you do advise that, actually, we do have some issues here. This may affect this particular user group or this particular set of technology, and just owning up to that, but also then saying, we are working on this. Here's a bit of a timeline. This is when we're looking to get this fixed, and just being kind of open and transparent in that way will do you a lot of favors, rather than just having something that is not accessible and people stumbling across that and then complaining. But if they know that you've got a plan of action, then they'll be much more encouraged to continue to use your services. So just briefly, some requirements for when you're creating an accessibility statement. So making sure that it's easy to find and easy to understand. Making sure it's accurate, so updated at least every year. Make sure you're including standards that you adhere to. So that could be the WCAG 2.2 AA standards, for example. Making sure that you're using clear, simple language. It's good practice to publish a roadmap of your aims, as I said, so advising your current pain points, but then also your path to approaching them. And also having some contact details as well. So, making sure you have a way of engaging with your users and that they can engage with you. And that just helps you get a deeper understanding of their needs to potentially find further areas of concern that perhaps weren't picked up in your WCAG audit. And I've just provided a link to the W3Cs, the people that or the organisation that publishes the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Their guidance and statement generator is just a really great resource for sort of further understanding what you need to include in your statement, and then they actually help you to put your statement together and generate that. And then if you are under a legal obligation to publish an accessibility statement, such as being in the public sector, then there is specific information that you must include and a required format to sort of follow. So I've just added a link there that details all of this information if that is relevant to you. So just in terms of disability awareness then, so making an accessibility commitment is not just about meeting technical standards. There's also staff training considerations as well. And ideally, this would be for all staff, but we can start thinking about whether key members of staff in relevant roles have the training that they need on disability awareness or testing tools. So it's good to start by creating a training plan to identify who needs to be trained on what and to what level. Will this training be in-house or third-party training? So in-house will obviously require certain knowledge and skills and resources, but third-party can impact budget. So definitely something to consider there. But as I said before, you may have some people within your organization, unbeknownst to you, that do have some accessibility knowledge and experience that perhaps they can share. You also want to prioritize resources, of course, so identifying which people and teams will have the biggest impacts from training and then potentially starting there. And you also want to think about which level of training staff require and how you want to embed that within your organization. So it could be to do with having some core accessibility awareness, So just understanding the fundamentals of accessibility, who it affects and why, which can be organization-wide. It's great for everyone to sort of get that understanding, get that knowledge and that awareness. It could be to do with WCAG 2.2 guidelines specifically, where more in-depth knowledge of these standards is required. So this could be more geared towards, designers or testers or developers, for example. Or it could be quite specialist testing training. So training in the use of specific tools that you've decided to adopt. So it could be screen reader training, for example, or manual or automated testing training. So just to very briefly summarize some of the policy principles then. So ideally identify which regulations are relevant for your organization, agree on an accessibility standard to uphold, such as the WCAG 2.2 AA standard, identify if your organization will publish accessibility statements and develop a process for this, and then just ensure that relevant staff have or will receive some form of accessibility or disability awareness or skills training. So up to this point, we have focused on the accessibility policy itself, but there will be other related policies that may affect the accessibility policy. So the first one is your technology policy, if that's something that you have. So the technology that you use can affect the impact and level of accessibility that you can meet. So you may want to think about what technology you'll be using. So for example, what content management system, CMS system, you're using. You may be using a JavaScript framework. Your PDF documents may be created from InDesign or converted from a Word document, etc. And in each of these cases, the way that you approach accessibility may be slightly different. Also, the tools that you use may be slightly different, while the actual WCAG will still apply and the same criteria will apply. How you go about actually implementing that may differ. What best practice guidance you will adopt. So you want to capture any accessibility limitations that you have and identify the pain points so that you can develop ways to overcome these. And these may not perhaps be covered in the WCAG, for example. As I said, the WCAG is not the be-all end-all of accessibility. That's kind of a minimum standard we want to meet. So perhaps you'll have some best practice guides you want to add on top of that. Obviously, reviewing the current technology policy, just to see if it can be updated to be in line with your accessibility policy. And then review what is currently in place. So making sure that you're not creating several policies across multiple documents, but keeping things more minimalist and concise is always a good way to go. And then create a process for selecting technologies in the future with accessibility as a key criteria, or at least one of the criteria. So moving forward, now that you have an accessibility policy, it's about seeing whether you can or need to make any changes with regards to the technologies that you're currently using or that you're looking to procure in the future. So embedding accessibility constraints within your content management system can help to maintain accessibility over time. So for example, the CMS could automatically format text. So this can be for headings or lists, for example, where these things are automatically marked up in an accessible way. It could require authors to include attributes. So if they're adding an image, it will require them to include alt text, for example. It could provide contextual help, so including advice and tips for implementing accessibility. So for example, if you're including a video, it may come with a little message to say, does this have captions, does it have a transcript, etc. So accessible content creation is vital for maintaining an accessible website or app, especially when content is continuously being added and changed. So trying to find a CMS that can, help provide additional accessibility guidance or just implementations in general is a really a good way to go. You may also have a testing policy. So this is critical to ensuring the websites and apps you create are accessible in the first place and should take place throughout the development process. You may already be doing some of this, but we're just kind of focusing on testing that specifically impacts accessibility. So just some things that you could do, a web audit using WCAG 2.2 or in-house standards, test throughout the development process, so not just at the end. So this is to continually embed accessibility and ensure that you remain on the right path from design to development. of course, testing with people with disabilities. This does usually come towards the later stages of development, but can be from the design offset as well, just to make sure that you're starting on the right foot. But it is just a really great way to get first-hand feedback, which includes usability as well as accessibility, because as we said, the WCAG doesn't cover absolutely everything, and you just cannot beat getting feedback from those with lived experiences. And then, of course, ensuring that staff have the skills and knowledge to test effectively as well. So definitely important to document the tools that they're using, and perhaps guidance on how to use them. But we'll be discussing a bit on tools in just a moment. So you can have testing at different stages of a product's lifecycle, as you've mentioned, and you want to identify which stages of your development process you can test at. So at the very start, when you're coming up with ideas and assessing the business requirements or the functional design, wireframes, so you can look at navigation and page layouts. When you've got the visual designs, so audit the colors that are being used, for example. It could be at the template stage. So here you can do some more comprehensive checks, such as with certain tools and assistive technologies. And then you could be at the full site build, or at least sort of a testing environment. And here you can test the user journeys. You can look at completing tasks, operating different components, and just making sure they all meet the accessibility standards. Of course, by doing a full audit is the best way to go there. And then, of course, user acceptance testing, so making sure to include people with a range of disabilities to ensure that your content is both accessible and usable. And then, of course, post-launch, so making sure you are maintaining the accessibility of the content and the processes and guidelines are in place when new content is added or when existing content is amended. So a common question we get asked is whether you need to be carrying out a WCAG audit on every single page of your website or your app. And the answer is essentially no. And this is because there's around 50 WCAG criteria, as we mentioned, a few more now with the 2.2 or testable conditions. So if, for example, you have 100 pages, that would amount to around 5,000 checks or over 150 hours of auditing, which is just obviously not possible. But also in modern web or app development, you tend to use template assistance, which means some of your content appears on all pages. So testing those over and over again would just duplicate your efforts and you would end up getting the same results. So what you can do instead is select a representative sample of unique pages which have unique templates, content, components, etc. And this way you're making sure that you're covering all of these unique, all this unique content without duplicating your efforts. And then you can take your findings and apply them to the rest of the website or the app. And the WCAG evaluation methodology link that I've added there is just a really great resource for guiding you through the process of defining the scope and exploring your website to identify the key pages for testing. But there are different approaches that you can take to carrying out testing, but it's always good to use a range of tools and techniques to ensure that you are testing thoroughly. So you can use automatic checkers. You can do manual checks, and you can also use site scanners as well. But make sure to document any and all tools and methodologies that you're using for testing in your policy. And this just gives you better structure and consistency across the process, as well as different tools may output slightly different results, or at least in different ways. And this consistency also goes for everyone testing on the same browsers, devices, systems, versions, etc., as well as just to make sure that an issue isn't found that actually relates to a specific browser or a version bug, for example. And it also allows for easier replication of findings as well when things are consistent. So as I said, you can use automated tools, and this can assist with finding some accessibility issues, but it should not be seen as the be-all end-all for finding accessibility issues. So the Gov UK actually did a review of automated tools, which only found up to 40% of accessibility issues, which is definitely a good start. But you can see that it's always a good idea to include additional manual testing as well. So automated checkers are still very useful, but they do have limitations, so do bear that in mind. Their issue reports are also quite difficult to understand, and this is because multiple issue reports the same sort of problem, which means it will look like you have thousands of issues when really they're all to do with one concern. So for example, it could be to do with alt text on images, or it could be color contrast. Especially if these are repeated throughout pages, it may just be one color contrast issue, but you've used that color 100 times, and so it'll flag up that you've got hundreds of issues, and can just seem quite overwhelming, and sometimes can be quite difficult to understand. And there can also be multiple tests for a single success criteria, again bringing up these numerous issues that essentially reflect the same thing. And then there's issues that will need further human review anyway. So a lot of the times these automated testers will say, manual reviewing is required, such as confirming whether something does contrast in terms of color, or if there's good heading structure, or how descriptive alt text is. So it may be able to tell you that an image does or does not have alt text, but it can't tell you whether that alt text is any good, for example. So just very briefly to say that there's a couple of examples of some really good free automated tools that you can use. One of them is called Axe, although you can pay for more premium functionality, but you can use it for free. And it's a very widely used tool for accessibility checking. You may even be using it already. It can be used on Firefox and Chrome. You can get extensions for that. And it's also built into a few other bits of software as well, like Google Lighthouse or the Microsoft Accessibility Insights tool. I would in particular point you towards that Microsoft Accessibility Insights tool. It's just a really fantastic, simple sort of laid out tool for automated testing. And it also guides you through automated and manual testing as well. And it gives you this nice little checkbox for going through each of the sort of WCAG criteria. So definitely check that out. And there's definitely some guides out there that'll help you to kind of get to grips with it, but it is quite a simple tool. But yeah, as I said, automated checkers can be very useful and can point you in the right direction, but you will definitely need to also use some manual testing as well. And there are some specialized tools that you can use to do this. So for example, you can run through your content with a screen reader. So JAWS, it's one of the more popular, more widely used screen readers, but it does require a paid-for license, which is very expensive. So we also have what's called NVDA, which is also a very, very popular screen reader, but it is free to download and use. We would also recommend using that for your testing as well, because JAWS can be it's almost too intuitive when it comes to testing purposes. So it's fantastic for sort of end users, because sometimes it masks accessibility issues and tries to sort of guess what a button could be and tries to be very helpful. But when it comes to testing, we don't want those to be masked. We want to know exactly what is right or wrong with our content, which is why NVDA is a good one, because if something is not accessible, then it will not communicate it accessibly. And then also you can use VoiceOver. So if you have an Apple product, then VoiceOver is a screen reader for that. And TalkBack is on Android devices, and these are already built in. So you already have access to these. And then, yeah, there's a lot of resources online that will point you through how to sort of use these in a basic way. And that's all you need to know how to do. It's just basic sort of navigation just to check your content. We also have things like Zoom Text, so a magnification tool. It does have a reader built into it, so you don't necessarily need to get this, but just sort of magnifying your browsers, increasing the text size, for example, and then just making sure that all of your content is still visible, everything can still be operated. You have things like Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is a voice-activated speech recognition software. Again, may not be necessary to use that, because if you're using sort of keyboard testing, using screen reader testing, that should cover that as well, but definitely something you can look into. And then we can also use what are called bookmarklets. So these are super easy to install and can help test for lots of accessibility issues, such as bringing up the alt text of images on a page, or seeing if headings are implemented correctly. So I can just very briefly show you what I mean. So the link that I've got on my slides there will bring you to this page. And there's lots of accessibility bookmarklets out there, but essentially a bookmarklet is just like a bookmark, on when you save a specific page on your browser. But in this case, it's just a little bit of JavaScript code, and all you have to do to install it, go to this website and you drag. Say, for example, we want to check if our web page has what alternative text we've got for our images. We can just drag the images one, put it up to our favorites bookmark bar, and then we're ready to go. So I've just got this page loaded up here, and we can check and just press that images, bookmark it there, and you'll see all the images on our page. It will come up with the alt text, and we can quickly go through and see whether that is correct for what we want to communicate. Where we see empty alt text, it means that this is decorative, so that's a good sign, because there's some bits of content that we don't want to be communicated to a screen reader user. When it's decorative, it means that it's not important for understanding the page. So an empty alt attribute is the way to go there. And then we also have things like headings, for example. So if we want to get a quick glimpse of the headings on our page, so I'll just refresh that. We press this headings, then it'll tell us the sort of what is a heading and what level of heading that has been marked up as. And so this is a H1, so this is the main heading of the page, which is great. We have some H2s here, and then within that we have H3, so there's a good nested hierarchy there of headings on our page. So yeah, just some examples of bookmarklets that you can use, and there's quite a lot of different ones there. And that can help with your manual testing as well. And there's also color contrast analyzers. So this allows you to determine if colors of text or informative graphics contrast well enough to meet the WCAG guidelines. This is pictured on my slide here. It's one that we use at AbilityNet. But essentially put in the two colors of, say, it could be the foreground text and the background color, and it'll give you this contrast ratio. And then down at the bottom here, it'll tell you whether you pass or fail the WCAG criteria. But yeah, I put a link to that on my slides. And then finally, the PEAT tool. So this is the photosensitive epilepsy analysis tool, and just allows you to check videos or animations for flashing content that may impact people who have epilepsy, for example. So yeah, just a nice tool to use. Upload your videos, and that'll tell you if there's any sort of flashing that will be impactful for some people with certain epilepsy impairments. So just some examples of tools that you can use, but there's many, many more that can help with your manual testing. And again, you want to make sure that whatever tools you use, these are documented and available, so it's consistent across your staff and teams. But of course, as you briefly mentioned, definitely worth doing diverse user accessibility testing and documenting this within your policy as well. So yeah, before you do this, it's always good to kind of get your content to a good standard. I mean, definitely include people and their voices and their ideas in your ideation and your sort of design stage. But when it comes to actual testing of the content, you want to make sure that it's in some sort of a good condition, just so they're not kind of blocked immediately and then can't continue with their journey or their testing. And yeah, it's just a really good way of getting their sort of practical insight. And seeing the importance of a site's usability for people with disabilities. As we said, the WCAG is not entirely comprehensive. For example, you can build a website that is technically compliant to the WCAG, but it's just completely unusable. So yeah, definitely getting some actual diverse user testing in is the best way to make sure that you have some comprehensive evaluation of your websites. So I just wanted to then talk very briefly about procurement. So even if you're procuring goods and services, you still need to consider all of the above of what we mentioned to do with accessibility, but there are some specific considerations that we want to make. So it's definitely important that they are aligned to your accessibility policy and meet your required standards. And we briefly did touch on this earlier, but essentially you want to share your standards as appropriate. So third parties are fully aware of your requirements and can be aligned to your vision. You want to ensure that this is reflected in any contracts that you have. And then you want to think about how you will verify these standards. So, whether you have expertise in-house that can do this, that can verify that something you've procured is accessible, or perhaps you need to go to an external source to ensure that as well. But there are some questions that you can ask when procuring products and services. So do they have any examples that they could share with you, perhaps on another website, so that you can check whether it meets the WCAG 2.2 AA standard before you purchase that. Do they have references from previous clients, and do these mention anything about accessibility? Is there evidence of practical knowledge within the third-party company? So the people that you're talking to, do they have any idea about accessibility? Are they clued up about what legislation covers different organizations and websites and the Equality Act, for example? And what is the testing process? Do they just use automated tools? Do they do any manual testing with screen readers, for example? So how will they ensure that it is accessible and it remains accessible? Do they have any guarantees with that? Do they have an accessibility statement or other sort of documentation? So, for example, a VPAT, it's a sort of a formal document that outlines the accessibility of digital content, similar to a WCAG audit, but a little bit more extensive. Will they work with a third party? So would they be willing to work with someone you have chosen to independently ensure that it's accessible? How will the needs of disabled and elderly users be taken into account? So have they done any requirements gathering? Do they use diverse and inclusive personas? Are they carrying out any diverse user testing? Have they got a named contact or project manager with understanding and experience of accessibility that you can be in contact with? And crucially, will they be on the project that you're doing? So the person that you're talking to that has this accessibility knowledge, will they be part of that project? Will they be someone you can be in contact with and ask questions? So these are just some good questions that you can ask to find the right supplier for you. But procurement is definitely a tricky area, especially if you've got quite niche needs. And then just finally, I just wanted to mention quite an important part of your accessibility policy will definitely be gathering feedback. So you want to consider how you're going to collect and respond to the feedback. And to do this, you want to make sure that you have clear feedback mechanisms. So whether this is on the accessibility page itself of your website, or perhaps on the contact us page, you want to make sure that you've got perhaps an email or phone number or some sort of form that a person can fill in. Having multiple methods is always a great way to ensure that you're being inclusive, as people, like to get in contact in different ways that suits their specific needs. Make sure that you're collecting useful information. So this could include the impairment of the user, the assistive technologies, or the browser or the device or the operating system that they may be using, where they're experiencing the issue, how serious they find the issue, because all of this information is really useful to the website owner and just helps them to better identify the core issues, helps them to replicate it, and then obviously find the best solution for remediation. And then make sure that your accessibility statement has a feedback mechanism and the contact information there as well. So if it is something that is on your contact us page, then make sure that within your accessibility statement, you are pointing to that so that they can find that information nice and easy. And in terms of responding to feedback, you want to make sure that support staff know how to deal with accessibility related communications. This may require some awareness training, for example. You want to have a dedicated space to log accessibility related comments and of course, thank users for their feedback as well. And then of course, deal with any complaints as quickly and effectively as possible. And then just in a similar sort of vein, reviewing your policy is obviously very important. We want to evaluate its success and see what worked well and where improvements are needed. So you need to consider how you are going to monitor and evaluate how well the policy is working and think about what data could be collected over time to help with this. So it could be through looking at queries and complaints and the time they took to resolve. It could be the volume of issues that are discovered in the quality assurance and within your audits as well. It could even be the percentage of staff with training, for example. But you need to first determine which stage you're at to see which metrics is best for reviewing the policy. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list, so you may have other evaluation ideas as well, but it's always very good to review your policies. And ideally, you want to be reviewing it on a regular basis, at least every year, every 12 months, and have some sort of a meeting of key stakeholders to review things like what worked well, what didn't work and why, review any feedback that you've gotten, make some recommended amendments if there are any changes to laws or regulations, for example, or you want to aim for a higher WCAG conformance level, or maybe you want to support more platforms. And then you want to identify any follow-up actions and make sure that they have ownership as well. But like gardening, accessibility is a continuous process, as we mentioned before. It doesn't just stop when you plant the first seed. It's an ongoing project that at the beginning may require a lot of effort and time and resources, but as you persevere and your experience and knowledge grows, it will just become business as usual. But it can go wrong if it's not being tended to. So it is an iterative process that presents constant opportunities to learn and improve. And it's something that should be embedded organization-wide. So the more people you have on board to drive forward that shared vision, the easier it will be. So just very quickly, we've covered a lot of ground. So thank you very much for bearing with me. We've talked about why an accessibility policy is needed and how this helps us to embed accessibility within our projects. We looked at creating a policy and what we need to consider. So looking at planning and ownership. We looked at maturity models as well. Looked at the different policy principles, like regulations and the standards. Took a look at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as well. We looked at some related policies like general technology policies, testing, procurement. And then finally, we looked a bit at policy feedback and reviewing the policy and the importance of those parts of our policy creation and gathering sort of any sort of accessibility feedback from our end users. So yeah, does anyone have any final questions? I will have a look at the chat, see if anything's coming through there. I see you've been busy, Paul. Thank you very much. But yeah, if no more questions, I'm more than happy to stay on if anyone does have any questions. But if not, then just last thing to say is thank you all very, very much for your time today. I hope you found that useful. You had some good takeaways from that. And yeah, best of luck with your accessibility journeys. If you do have any questions after this, then do sort of pass those on. We can look into them. I know there's a few questions in the chat. I'll go back through those, make sure we've either answered all of them or we can provide some more resources and I'll add that within the slide deck before we send it over to you. So yeah, again, thank you all so much. Do feel free to drop off, but like I said, I'm more than happy to stay on and answer any questions if there are any. But yeah, take care everyone, have a good rest of your week and yeah, hopefully see you back here soon. Oh, someone said, should an image that is aesthetic have a description anyway? That is a very good question. So there's this new, so beforehand, it used to be a case of if something is decorative, it has no sort of formal meaning about what the page is about, what the image is about, then it's just decorative, it's just purely for visual gain, then that can have no alternative text. That should be ignored by screen readers. But now there's this new thought pattern of what are called emotive images. So the reason that we add images is because we want to present a certain light, we want to evoke a certain meaning. And so there are these emotive images that, if we hide them, then perhaps the screen reader user who can't see the image is missing out on that. It could be something that makes a user feel a certain way when they come onto your website or when they view your content. And so it's really up to yourself. If you feel, I'm putting this image on here because I want to evoke a certain emotion, because I want to convey something in particular, then do feel free to put in alternative text for that. But of course, make sure that alternative text is concise, is kind of to the point. You don't want these sort of long, lengthy essays on an alternative text. But yeah, that's a really, really good and important question because, a lot of the time it was just this divide between do they need to know versus what is just, something visual. But it's always good to kind of have that takeaway of, actually, this is presenting more than just specific information. It's something that is providing some more emotional information. So that's always something to consider as the content author. The context of why you put that image there, what sort of what you're trying to evoke from that image. So yeah, really great question. If it's something you feel is something that people should understand and see from your image, then yeah, definitely feel free to add some good alternative text there. A lot of fantastic questions today. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Who can we receive technical support and future guidance in this regard? So the NDA actually have a lot of really fantastic support and guidance on their website. So definitely get in contact with them if it's to do with sort of providing that accessibility support that you need. If it's to do more with like auditing and things like that, I'm sure they have resources and point to things like that. But there's a lot of organizations out there, AbilityNet included, that can provide that technical support in terms of doing WCAG audits or diverse user testing, or of course training. So yeah, there's a lot of resources out there, but the NDA is definitely a good place to potentially start, depending on what you're looking for. Lots of lovely thank yous from everyone. Thank you. How accurate is the Axe monitor tool, and is there a guide on how to understand the report it generates? Yeah, so it is accurate in terms of the accessibility issues that it finds, but like I said, where it kind of, and this is all automated tests, where they fail is that they can't determine certain aspects of it. So like I said, they can say that this image doesn't have alternative text, or this image does have alternative text, but it can't tell you if that's descriptive alternative text. So with the example that we saw of Alan Turing, it had the alternative text of just the letter T, and it won't flag that up as an issue, for example. It will go, yep, that's got alternative text, cool, let's move on. It won't go, that's not descriptive at all, that is, So it is accurate in terms of the things that it can measure. But of course, yeah, generally they only pick up around 40% of accessibility issues, so you will need to do some extended manual testing as well. In terms of a guide on how to understand the report that it generates, I believe Axe is built by Deque, so do feel free to look on their website. I believe they do have some guides that will kind of show you exactly how that works and how to read those reports. But for the most part, they are relatively straightforward. They try to make them obviously as usable as possible. But yeah, especially if you're not as technical, then it can be a little bit overwhelming. So yeah, do check out their website, and of course YouTube. A great resource for getting some guides on how to understand that stuff. Very informative webinar. Is there any sessions targeted for developers? It's
the 9th of April, Jack.
That's April,
this is,
right? I see.
Donal here. So you'll get information on that on ics.ie or the nda.ie websites.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions. Amazing engagement for everyone there. And thanks, Donal. I really appreciate you introducing that as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and looking forward to getting the recording and the slides. Brilliant.
Absolutely. Send them over soon.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thanks,
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.